Having been someone that started reading this manhwa relatively recently, only about 2 years ago when I started, I was fairly hyped up for the God of High School's anime. I had a lot of fun reading through it when I first started, and I was really looking forward to enjoying this series with friends. The sad thing, though, is that the anime elitists really seem to hate anime based on Korean properties, and it's been poisoning the anime community this year. Ever since the God of High School's anime started, people have been saying that this anime was a bad adaptation. However, the ironic thing is how off-base they really are, because this isn't a bad adaptation in the slightest. It actually improves upon a lot of the problems that the manhwa had in terms of its writing. Of course, there are some changes that happened in the anime, but they're nothing that actually harms its adaptation. I'll be talking about the significant changes, clearing up the massive lie that the community has been spreading, and some minor changes that ultimately didn't affect anything. So, let's start out by clearing the lie that the community has been spreading. I'm sure you've heard of it by now. The adaptation is rushing through the season. This was what I constantly heard as I was rereading through the first season of the manhwa near the end of the summer 2020 season of anime. There were many different lies I'd heard floating around, but the most consistent lie was that the anime skipped lots of fights and went through its content at breakneck speeds. At first, I thought there might be some truth because of how consistent people were with the lie, but upon actually watching the anime, I couldn't believe how fucking stupid people were. The anime doesn't really skip fights. Some were changed around slightly, and they even added fights that weren't originally there in the manhwa. The total number of fights that were skipped in the anime is, realistically, only 1. Throughout the first half of the first season of the manhwa, there were around 5 fights that happened within the Seoul tournament. Most of these fights aren't even shown because they're heavily one-sided, up until the finals of that tournament. The manhwa only showed the fights that involved our main characters, so it was amazing to even see these completely new fights. The only part of this section in the manhwa that wasn't included was Commissioner Q and R sparring, but that wasn't really a fight. For the second half of the anime, there were mostly minor differences. This half housed the only skipped fight in the series, a fight between Daewee and Bora within the holy place that eventually turns into Daewee against a ton of Jagal clones. There were a few fights that were slightly changed, but there weren't many major changes. Those are what I'll be talking about next though. For this part, we'll be talking about things related to a fairly major spoiler, so please do keep that in mind. There are a few significant changes regarding Mori, specifically relating to his power and how he obtains it. These changes overall were better for the story than what we got in the manhwa, but as a result, it did change a couple of things for the worse. In the manhwa, Mujin didn't give Mori the divine peach to eat. He stumbled upon Bangchim Na while he was being detained in the organization facility after getting disqualified. Upon discovering the divine peach, he eats it and releases Bangchim, who then stabs Mori. In the anime, he just coughs up blood after eating the peach and passes out. In both versions, Mori is late for his fight against Commissioner Q, but the anime version makes a lot more sense for him to be late, as his house isn't that close to the arena. The downside to this change is that you don't get a proper introduction to Bangchim Na, and it doesn't really explain that Mori learns acupuncture from him until the final episodes, leaving a big question unanswered for way longer than it needs to be. The handling of the Bangchim Na scenes is the only thing that I can say the adaptation did not handle well, as he's a character that is very important to Mori's growth as a fighter. There were also some changes to fights involving Mori, but it was only done to offer a better understanding to how his power was unlocked. In the manhwa, Mori's power as the Monkey King came straight out of left field. The only clue you really even got to it was the Divine Peach, but it's not something a normal person would have ever predicted happening. It wasn't built up to or anything, it was barely even foreshadowed, and when it happened, it was just confusing for a while. The anime fixes the major problem about Mori's reveal of being the Monkey King as it added a proper build-up to it, and I was very happy with that because it was one of many things that the manhwa didn't do the best. Because of this change, the fight against Ilpyo in the finals was changed from Mori taking an endurance fight against the entire team by himself, to having him fight just Ilpyo only to realize that he has a power that he doesn't understand. The fights against Tech Jagal are mostly the same. I mentioned a little of this a bit earlier, but I'm going to be elaborating a bit more on it. In the manhwa, the starting fight with Ilpyo and Jagal happens while they're in the finals ring. While the change to this part in the anime is very minor, it emphasizes a part of Ilpyo's character that was inconsistent in the manhwa, considering the scenes that happened right before it. The way the fight goes in the anime is mostly the same, but the major difference between the versions is that Jagal gets eaten by Tem, one of the powers within his body. Everything important after this part, except the holy place fight and one fight involving the key, is the same as it is within the manhwa, but with a bit of an art change in places. Because of that, the last significant change I'll be talking about is Tem. Tem isn't really talked about in the anime, and it's not even mentioned by name. I consider this a negative for the adaptation because Tem serves a large part in the series. It's essentially an important villain for 4 seasons of the manhwa. How Tem was handled is something I wish more people would have talked about over them saying that the anime is bad because they didn't like its OP, or because they added fights to the series. It has this interesting ability to consume people and their borrowed powers, while allowing its host to use those powers. The anime even shows us that it can do this, but it never talks about it or gives it an explanation. It just ends up being confusing for people that haven't read the manhwa. With its lack of an explanation, it inevitably causes some scenes to leave you with questions. For example, the scene with Jugok where he's mutated into this red beast. If you didn't read the manhwa, you wouldn't know that he was given Tam, and it consumed him. Tam might not be the most important in Season 1, but it's prevalent enough to negatively impact the story because it has such a large role in Mori's ascension into godhood, and an even greater effect on the taboo that is constantly being mentioned. After that, there is one more change worth mentioning, but that is between significant and insignificant: the handling of our main characters' backstories. In the manhwa, the entire story starts with a single episode each dedicated to one of our main trio. The anime starts out on episode 4 of the manhwa, and later incorporates those backstories at a time where they feel more relevant, which I feel helps the story a lot since the start of the manhwa feels very disjointed because of it. Everything else is pretty much minor or insignificant in terms of changes. The only thing really missing is some jokes and gags that gave more charm to the characters, Obama, and explanations of martial arts. The coolest thing that an anime only would miss out on is the really interesting story behind the forms of Taekwondo in this universe, including the significance of Mori's renewal Taekwondo. The loud opinions of this adaptation have all been so negative, but this is nowhere even close to how bad they say it is. It's a very great adaptation. It could have been better in some spots for sure, but at the end of the day, it was amazing. It might not have been a perfect adaptation, but it improved quite a decent bit of the manhwa's story without sacrificing much. I'm just so sick of seeing people saying that it's a bad adaptation when anyone who's read the source material knows how much of a bold-faced lie that is. I ask everyone who watches this to just go and read the first season of the manhwa if you haven't, and then rewatch the anime. You'll really be baffled to see how stretched that lie actually was. Also join my Discord, links are in the description.